welcome everybody to the regulatory challenges in the COVID era small atelier. As Eddie mentioned, my name is Hrabrina Hristova. I'm from PharmaLex, Bulgaria, and I will be moderating today's session. It's really a pleasure to have you all here today, and especially in the view of those unprecedented and difficult times. We all know that managing a complex crisis like COVID-19 can be extremely challenging for all of us as human beings, as responsible adults care for our children, and of course as professionals, especially being part of the pharmaceutical industry and having to deal with various aspects of being in a lockdown. Like shortages around the world, huge backlogs, or lack of any feedback from health authorities, and in some cases, dealing with reduced work hours of colleagues and partners who need to take care of their children and are not available to work full time. So it became clear very early on that routine approaches and single issue responses or action plans may not be effective in such a critical situation. So we at PharmaLex decided to create a shared space, a special portal where we can collect the information received in terms of new and updated regulatory requirements, shortages at health authorities, reduced working hours, or even closed agencies, delays in submissions, responses, or as mentioned before, a lack of any feedback. And actually one of our panelists today, Mr. Diego Zalava, who is the Regional Senior Manager LATAM at PharmaLex, he is responsible for keeping this database at PharmaLex up to date and complete for the PharmaLex experts internally, but also for our clients who rely on our knowledge and expertise. So today, Diego will talk about the regulatory measures taken during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll have a very thorough overview from really a global perspective. Our next panelist today will be Dr. Autumn Lang, who is the co-founder and CEO at Confinis CPM. Dr. Lang's specialty is chartering the clinical research pathway to market access for medical devices companies. So naturally, Dr. Lang's presentation will be focused on clinical regulatory challenges. And hopefully at the end of today's panel, we will have really a deep understanding of what day-to-day the regulatory experts are dealing with, and of course, what impact the COVID-19 pandemic will have on our ultimate goal, patients' access to medicinal products. So without further ado, Diego, the stage is yours. Please feel free to share your presentation.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Ina. I will share my screen now. Please let me know when you see it.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to participate in this atelier. As already Ina mentioned, I'm Diego Zavala. I am the Regional Senior Manager for the LATAM region in PharmaLex, Germany. And the topic that I will talk about today is the regulatory measures that were taken during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I divide the presentation in 5 sections. The first one will be just a short overview, how everything started. Then I will talk about a little bit how countries try to avoid shortages. Then I will talk about also in a short way for clinical trials. And then what's going on with not-related COVID-19 submissions. And finally for GMP inspections. So let's start. As an overview, as you remember, in the last day of 2019, there was a report from China that some pneumonia from unknown origin were detected in a city called Wuhan. And after that, it was identified as a new coronavirus known as COVID-19. Therefore, this information was shared with the WHO, and its emergency committee declared COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern due to the capacity of the virus to spread among the population. So to accelerate the development of vaccines and medicines or diagnosis products to detect COVID-19, the WHO relied on the group that they have called the Blueprint Strategy, which basically it's a group formed by experts in medicine, scientific, and regulatory background that focus on research and development activities. So basically, this group start activities all around the world to detect um, um, the disease, not only for COVID. This is also for any kind of pandemic around the world. Also, they look for vaccines and, of course, medicines that treat the infection. So, and in order to do this, they publish something called target product profiles. These target product profiles basically are the attributes and minimal and acceptable and preferred criteria that a product should have in order to be used to treat the disease. In this case, COVID-19, but also can be done with another one like Ebola, for example. So, and in this case, they publish four TPPs for medical devices. So the focus was on point of care test for suspected COVID-19 cases, test for diagnosis or confirmation of acute or subacute COVID-19 infection, point of care test for prior infection, and the last one, test for prior infection with COVID-19 for moderate or high volume needs. Everything you can find it in WHO webpage if you are interested in. So that was from the WHO. What about countries? So around the world, at the beginning, as you of course know, business were closed, manufacturing sites were closed, government offices were closed, and flights canceled. We were asked to use protection equipment, at least here in Germany, in all closed buildings. You need to use a mask. Also in the public transport, and if possible, use disinfectants and sanitizers in your hands or in surfaces. Also, even here in Europe, in the Schengen space, borders were closed in order to avoid the spread of the infection and also, of course, reduce the mobility of people. So let's move now after the overview to how countries try to avoid shortages. Well, the measures taken in Europe, for example, the specified committee that the EMA has for these kind of situations create the industry single point of contact, with basically it's a group of people and very high level in the EMA offices who take care and have contact with companies and provide them with information how they should manage and prevent the shortages from their companies, especially taking into account that most of the APIs and excipients come from countries like China and also India, and these countries were really affected by the pandemic. So you may not have the capacity to produce your medicines or your medical devices because you don't have the raw materials. So also they create the guideline on the optimal and rational supply of medicines to avoid shortages during the outbreak. And basically they guide companies and also countries to how to manage this, try to avoid, to keep everything in one country in the border and not giving to the other to the others just to cover themselves. So this is the kind of information that were provided for this committee. In the case of the FDA in the United States, they have FDA has the capacity to allow some companies to have something called emergency use authorizations, which basically is the use of a product for something that was not intended to use and it's not approved in the country, but probably could have some evidence that may work with this new infection. All of us remember that there was a lot of products mentioned by the President of the United States that could work, could not work. So, and this indication can be approved by the FDA, of course, based on some early information they may have. In the case of Canada, they have these special resolutions called interim orders, and they issue several ones, but the most important was for the for the importation and sales of medical devices, all of them related to COVID-19, of course, and the interim order respecting drugs, medical devices, and foods. Basically, the idea of these orders was to reduce the requirements to get approval or to get the product imported in the country. That was the main focus on these interim orders. In the case of Australia, they decided at the beginning of the pandemic that all over-the-counter medicines should be dispensing only one pack per client in order to avoid shortages and to guarantee the population that they would have the products that they need. Also, they issue all the products that were affected by COVID-19, sorry, and this means that all the products listed here should be dispensing in a very minimal way possible. And also for imported products, they accept now the document-based batch release, which is a protocol assessment. Normally in Australia, you should provide samples that will be analyzed and then release the product. And this is specifically important because this is used for biotech products. So in the case of Anvisa, for example, basically they issue another resolution where they mention all the requirements for manufacture, import, and acquisition for medical devices during the pandemic. Brazil is a very, very regulated market. So basically what they do was to be a little bit more flexible with the requirements for the importation of this kind of products. In the case of Saudi Arabia, for example, in the MENA region, they take a similar approach than FDA in the United States. They accept the use of some products that were not intended to treat the COVID-19. So, and these countries also has the possibility to get some special import permits, even if your product is not approved there, which is really, really important. It's just a kind of cultural thing from the MENA region. They are always open to negotiate. And if a product is really important for the population, they will have no problem to accept it without any previous approval, for example. In the case of India, consider the nature of the country that it's a good exporter of any kind of goods. They decide to give a fast track for approval of development of vaccines, diagnosis, and everything related to the COVID-19. Therefore, can be available in the country. You may know that this country is very high populated, so it's really, really necessary to have all the products necessary available. In the case of Germany, Germany also, the BfArM has the capacity to import products without local labeling. So you can send products for any country, keeping the labeling you have from origin. Maybe you can put a stick on it, but it's not mandatory. And regarding the manufacture of medicines, BfArM has also the capacity, legally speaking, to request the manufacturer of certain medicines to attend the pandemic as a general, not only COVID. So this is what they did during this time. In the case of Italy, United Kingdom, and Ireland, they accept the import of medical devices without CE mark. Here in Europe, basically everything has a CE mark, and I can say that for Italy it's really, really important, even for products that will be exported to other countries. So in this case, they were very, very flexible to accept products who doesn't have this mark, which is kind of quality seal that all the products should have, not only medical devices, toys, radios, computers, etc., should have this CE mark to be marketed in Europe. Let's move a little bit to Latin America. Argentina. Argentina has a simplified procedure for recognized countries. So they decide to implement this procedure also for COVID-19 products, even if they are not from a high surveillance country, in order to accelerate the procedure and have enough products for the population. In the case of South Korea, they gave a lot of priority to the submission for in vitro diagnostics devices. I remember that I heard on the news that Korea has managed quite well the pandemic because they made a lot of tests to the population, and it is because of this measure that they take to accelerate the import of in vitro diagnosis, especially rather than medicines, because there is none yet. So let's move now to the clinical trials. There were a lot of challenges once the pandemic started. For example, all the clinical trials were affected directly by COVID-19 pandemic. Why? Because a clinical trial involves by itself a lot of contact between people. So the doctor has a consultation with the patient, so they are in contact. The doctor has to contact the monitor, the clinical monitor to review the CFR. Then it's a human contact, so people in hospitals also. So that's really, really difficult situation for all clinical trials. So this caused a difficult to open new trial sites because everything was closed at that time. So the idea was to, for the closed sites, move the patients from one place to another, but sometimes the patient was not available to do so. That means that your amount of patients will be reduced significantly if you decide to close one site. But this is a risk-based assessment that you have to do. There was also difficulties to recruit new patients and also to deliver the investigation product. So sometimes was not possible, of course, to perform doctor's visit and also the monitoring, as we talked before. So in this case, there were a lot of similar approaches between countries and between regions. So for Germany, Health Canada, and Japan, they give priority assessments and approval to new clinical trials related to COVID-19. They also give, in the case of Germany, scientific advice for free for small company who try to perform some clinical trials. In the case of Europe and FDA, all the modifications to protocol should be done in a risk assessment and doesn't have to be approved by the ethics committee, which is very, very important because all the responsibility goes directly to the sponsor. But in the other way, it reduces the times to perform the clinical trial. You don't have to wait a lot of time to get any kind of approval. But in exchange, everything has to be notified with the respective risk analysis, and everything goes to the responsibility from the sponsor. So this is a difficult situation for them, maybe, but they will have the opportunity to keep going and not stop anything, which is really, really important. In the case of Italy and Spain, as you remember, these countries were really, really affected here in Europe by the pandemic. So they allow the remote monitoring wherever it's possible. But all the notifications, they have to do, urgent security measures, and they have to notify it every time it happens. There is no chance to wait to notify these kind of issues to the authority. In the case of Brazil, they also allow the remote monitoring, and for patients that were in the hospital, the triage amendments doesn't need approval from the authority, which is really a good news, because sometimes Brazil take its time to approve these kind of topics. But what about the non-COVID-19 submissions? At the end of the day, despite the pandemic and the priority that all these products receive, the business should keep going. So you cannot stop only because you don't have any product related to the pandemic. So this is really difficult for some companies, because some of the regulatory authorities were closed, personnel were working from home, and therefore you don't have the chance to ask something or to contact them directly. There was limited personnel available on site. Some MOH decide to work half of the staff one day, half of the staff another day, and so some countries, like in the Latin American region and some African countries, does not have e-submissions. Maybe for a small submissions, like maybe an import license or something like that, but for a new approvals, it's sometimes it's not possible. Therefore, there were delays in ongoing submissions due to this prioritization. Then, what countries did to contain this? What in Africa, Jordan, Kuwait, Honduras, and Nicaragua, the facilities were closed, so there was nothing to do for this. At this point, Honduras and Nicaragua are already open, which is a good news for the Central American countries. In the case of Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, they work with limited personnel, and they decide to suspend the legal deadline. So if you have 6 months or 9 months to get an approval from the authorities, then it will not longer apply until further notice. Now in Mexico, the legal deadlines are already reestablished, but that means that you will have delays on the submissions for non-COVID products. If submissions were possible, as I mentioned, normally for import and export topics, there is a lot of e-submissions, but not for new submissions, renewals, or modifications in these countries. So they decide, especially Mexico, to submit via postal services. They issue a list of submissions that can be done through this way, and they establish a very simple process to do this. In the case of Philippines in Asia, they decide to extend the renewal for 4 months. This was done recently, so they expect to move all the renewals prepared for 2020 until 2021. And in the case of Europe, they basically were flexible with the processes during COVID-19. Some flexibilities for the companies to get approvals, but of course there were a lot of delays. And finally, I would like to mention about GMP inspections. Also were affected, all of them, because of the pandemic. So what happened here? Same as clinical trials, were reduced personnel in manufacturing side, reduced production, which is quite critical because possible shortages. Qualified persons were not inside due to the quarantine. You know, some person has to work one day, the other another. So limited capacity for the companies to have qualified person inside. International inspections were not possible, and also GMP certificates were close to expiration date. So what the countries did. In case of Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, and Colombia, they canceled all the inspections in the country and outside the country. In the case of Brazil, they decide to recognize the inspection reports from the PICS, this international cooperation scheme, that basically Brazil is not a member of this, but they are following the same guidance. That's why they decide to accept these inspection reports. And in the case of Europe, Europe published the notice to stakeholders on the implementation of temporary changes to certain schedule quality-related tasks, which is basically flexibilities based on a risk assessment. You should keep the quality of your product as much as possible, even in the conditions that you have now. So basically, this is where the approaches around the world for GMP inspections. In the case of the United Kingdom, all the audits and self-inspections also were put on hold. Retesting, it's allowed now only as an identification. It's a simplified procedure, basically. In Mexico, the GMP certificates were extended for another 6 months, basically to the next year. In the case of Malaysia, they suspend all the inspection from 2020, and for next year will be based on a risk assessment based internally in the recommendations from the MOH in Malaysia and outside based on the situation for each country. And finally, as a global, the remote inspections using electronic media were allowed, inspections like the atelier that we are having right now through the computer, sending information in a secure way and by telephone, whatever it's possible to keep going with the inspection. And also the electronic signatures were accepted. Some countries does not accept this kind of signatures because they don't have a system that can guarantee that the signature it's legal, but in these cases they were flexible and decided to accept them. So that was all from my side. I thank you, all of you, for your time. Have a nice day, and this is my contact email in case you have comments that you want to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diego. It was really interesting to travel around the world and see what measures were taken and how different health authorities were able to really quickly, most of them, to adapt to the new situation and take different measures. There was one thing you mentioned at the end, the digitalization, and do you think that this pandemic situation somehow impacted and it prompted the authorities to faster adopt to new techniques and technologies and being able to recognize e-signatures or accept e-submissions, which was actually the case for Bulgaria here. The Bulgarian Drug Agency started to accept e-signatures.
Yes, I think at least it will show the need to have technology during the submission processes. I can tell you for Africa and Latin America, there is not too much technology used. Maybe, an electronic system to ask for an appointment, but you still have to go with your 15 carpets to submit a new application in the countries. So, and also the system that was established using the postal services was not so useful. It was kind of messy. It works somehow because you have to make it work, but yeah, you need at least the technology to accelerate the submissions. The criteria to be to accelerate the approval, which is another thing, I'm not really sure. It depends really on the countries. It's I would say that it's really a cultural thing. Europe, it's really focused on have approvals quite fast to keep going the industry, because all the responsibility goes to this to the manufacturing side or to the owner of the product. But in Africa, some countries in MENA, some countries in Latin America, the responsibility is shared between the owner of the product and the Ministry of Health. That makes that the Ministry of Health should guarantee that the product complies with all the regulations. This happens a lot in Mexico and Brazil, especially in Brazil. They are really, really tough by reviewing dossier. So that extends the time to get an approval. Even for a renewal, you can spend 3 years waiting for it. So I'm not really sure if they will decide to implement some processes that make approvals faster, mostly because of this part. This is something that normally the companies not see because they are not really aware of it. They want to sell, of course, and it's natural. It's a business. But the authorities sometimes could be quite reluctant to do this. So maybe they don't have the budget to do so. That's
and the capacities, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. And in your opinion, what do you think was really the biggest challenge during this period of lockdown? Because now we see delays, we see some shortages and things like that. But during the lockdown, what was the biggest challenge? Was it the time? Was it the capacities, the resources?
I think is to find a way to keep the business running. I mean, the not, especially the not non-COVID submissions, because now the priority is on COVID. So the system that you implement will work because all your people are working on it. But in order to do so, you have to leave the others behind. So, and you give some flexibilities like the renewal extended to next year or 6 months more to get a 6 months extension of your GMP, but you still have a plan. You know, you want to submit new products, you want to make some variations, etc., etc. So you cannot leave behind or that behind too much to the other type of submission. I think this could be a really big challenge.
Yeah, but it was also very interesting to see how flexible the authorities, some of them at least, could be, because for some famous ones, the famous with their really strict requirements, we were able to see that they agreed on to online auditing for GMP inspections, for example. The Russian authorities, which are really tough, usually during these GMP inspections, they were also able to adapt to online audits, and I personally was really impressed of how quick they were able to adapt.
Yeah, me too. Especially with Italy, I had a client who wants to export to Colombia a medical device before the pandemic, of course, and the MOH doesn't allow them to export it because it doesn't have the CE mark yet. They were working on it, but Colombia don't need it, but Italy requested. So and now if you try to do the same, will be done quite easily because it's no longer a requirement for export and for import. That kind of flexibility is quite impressive.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again. Teddy, do we have any questions from the audience?
Still no.
Sorry?
Still no.
Okay. Okay, so in case there are no questions from the audience, now we can go to our next panelist, Dr. Lang. Dr. Lang, if you're able to share your presentation.
Hello, this is Autumn.
Hi, Autumn. Yes, we're able to see the screen now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, there was a little overlap. The first speaker already talked about clinical trials. What I really wanted to focus on with my presentation about clinical regulatory challenges, specifically, there were two areas that we experienced as being clinical affairs specialists. that was directly related because of the developments since March. What we really saw was a disruption in clinical investigations. It didn't matter if it was for IVDs or for pharma or for medical devices, and also how the history of the framework, because of the slow evolution, it really caught up with us once COVID-19 disease started really spreading. So like the timeline from March till June, you really saw a very large spike in regards to the disruption. And when you went to things like global data, you're able to go in, you're able to search publicly, just asking in June, okay, how many organizations reported that they had a disruption in their clinical investigations? And there were 950 approximately. And out of those 950 organizations that were publicly stating in the public domain that they were having disruptions, 50% of those were US. And then when we looked at, because of our daily work, what were the most common disruptions that were happening was enrollment suspension, slow enrollment, delayed initiation. And this all goes back to patients, right? We're working with patients. Pharma, okay, you may say they're subjects. IVDs, you'd say, okay, it's a lab. Could be urine samples, it could be blood samples, or et cetera. Medical devices, we're working specifically with patients. The outcomes, it was for patients, it was a time of, I would say, from March to June, and now from July to September has stabilized again. But these patients who obviously are being treated for something, they have something. So their stress level of not only publicly the COVID-19, but also they're saying, but I'm a cancer patient. I'm in treatment. They're not letting me go to get do my follow-up. I'm not having access to, the kind of care that I had before. I'm part of this clinical study, so the thing in regards to from a clinical, a regulatory perspective was all about contingency plans, right? So we really had to go back to our safety plans that we have. So in pharma and IV, especially pharma, there's a lot more guidelines, a lot more rules available than, for example, in medical devices. So we were actually very surprised, especially in the medical device area, how quickly guidances were coming out. And not just, I highlighted the US and Europe, but in many other countries, they were providing specific guidances because of the frequently asked questions they were receiving. You can imagine it was kind of like a hotline of saying, well, what do I do now? I have all these deviations. I've got patients who, are quite out. It wasn't necessarily that they were panicked, but there was a underlying fear of, I may not be getting the most optimal treatment, and this may have long-term effects to the point of, we managing these studies, working with authorities, saying this is really going to impact our primary endpoint if we're not able to get patients at the same time period, and et cetera. So that is something that I wanted to reflect in this presentation was, okay, the challenges were these disruptions, but how were we actively dealing with those? And that was, well, first of all, thank goodness, the regulatory authorities understood we needed guidances. They delivered on that, and they will continue to be working on that. But we also had to rely on our daily work of contingency plans. We are used to being thrown curveballs. I personally, in my 21 years, did not have to work under a pandemic. I don't know if anybody else in the audience has that research, but I think most of us don't. So I think that was something where we had to go back to what we do best and saying, well, we can't just keep up. We have to lead. So we can't just wait for regulatory authorities to necessarily give us guidances, because alone in medical devices, the patient outcomes are so diverse that individually we really had to come up with contingency plans. So that's something that I was very happy to see, that people understood, hey, we have the skill set. This isn't the first time that we're throwing a curveball, and really taking their experiences and making up these contingency plans. So that's something that was a huge way of that these professionals have been dealing with, that with coming up with the contingency plans for the disruptions. The other one is something where our history is now catching up with us. We have always talked about there needs to be harmonization, there needs to be integration. The time has come where we've seen the evolution has not caught up to where it needs to be. The developments in science and technology. I'm still, even we're in 2020, even though we know that 1 in 4 pharma approved products in the EU will include a medical device component, we still have to go to separate authorities. There's no integration for this for these pathways in the EU. This is something that historically we've always talked about, urged that we need to have that, and now it's catching up with us, because a lot of the projects that they want to push through, actually there's going to be components of maybe an IVD, maybe a pharma, and maybe a medical device component. But right now, I still have to go through separate authorities for that in the EU, for example. And the other thing is this whole harmonization amongst the EU, Europe. We see a lot of things like if you go to the US FDA website, they'll talk about, yes, we partner with EU. It's one of our major partners. It's harmonization by doing Japan and US, for example. They're using words like harmonization, but I don't see coordination. I don't really see that when we do have crises that require to break down boundaries. Strategically, we're still responding by saying, okay, we're not going to go to Europe because it's not going to be fast enough. US is offering us a much faster way of responding in getting our device on the market, for example, that's specifically related to maybe the treatment management of COVID-19 patients. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's treating the disease, but the treatment management of them, for example. These are things where again, I feel that we knew something like this would come, and now is the time that we really need to talk about, okay, let's really try to hammer out and say, when time of crisis comes, how can we then have no borders? How can we say, hey, and I'll just give you an example. There's a device that's been approved for 10 years in the EU, which could be part of a treatment management of COVID-19 patients because of what the medical device would do, for example. But when I go to the US and say to them, okay, this device has been on the market already for 10 years in Europe. US does have a program we could go through, but in time of need where specific countries, Brazil, India, US, Peru, where they could possibly, due to the amount of patients who've already been using this device the last 10 years in EU, there should be a way of coordinating cross-nationally to be able to say, okay, this is a pandemic. So I'm hoping now there's going to be more definition of how they can become more innovative in a regulatory perspective to say, okay, this is no longer just affecting the US or just affecting EU or just affecting Southeast Asia populations, but I mean, there's a reason why it's called a pandemic. So that's something that we're really urging the evolution of the framework, regulatory framework, that continues. It doesn't stop. It goes a little bit faster. With the goal, obviously, to, in time of crisis, simplify procedures, minimize non-value adding activities, and accelerate delivery to the focus to the most critical tasks or outcomes we need to focus on. So, yeah. So from that perspective, this is how the challenges and how we feel that we can be learning from that. So moving forward, not just focusing on, okay, what were the challenges, but what steps can we take to be making sure that that's not a challenge in the future.
Thank you so much, Autumn. Really interesting, and I absolutely agree with you, especially the last slide when you basically summarized the three biggest challenges, namely harmonization in terms of medicinal products and devices between the authorities, and also the harmonization which is so needed and so much historically discussed between the different regions. Even though ICH does exist and we do have harmonized requirements, there are so many examples of drug products or devices which are registered in the EU and not registered in the US or vice versa. So it's really, it will be really great to have a harmonized approach all over the globe, of course, keeping in mind different requirements like climatic zones and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that was like, I remember when the Ebola vaccine was coming out, where I was like, well, you know, pushing back to the regulatory authorities and saying, well, how can that be? 1 month faster in the EU versus US. Well, so what was causing that? That they couldn't, you know, they couldn't approve that simultaneously. And then I know that a lot of people say, well, obviously the U.S., they have their specialists, they have, you know, U.S. FDA, they mandate to you what you need to do, right? You need to receive approval, blah, blah. And EU, it's up to the manufacturer to justify, you know, to justify to the notified bodies, et cetera. I understand that there are differences, but in regards to like an Ebola vaccine, where a month could actually save X amount of people's lives. That's where I'm like, but the definition needs to be changed, and maybe we need to rank or set an escalation process where we say, like I said, time of crises, then you need to have cross-national regulatory response to that, and not say, well, some people may say, hey, that's great. It was only 1 month difference. I think with COVID-19, if that's the same case with a vaccine, and we see one country totally doing it early, so nobody talks about it, but Russia claims that they have a vaccine. Okay?
Yeah,
nobody's touching that. Nobody's touching it. Why? Is it because of the name of it? Because it's Sputnik? I don't think so. So that's what I mean in regards to if a country like Russia says they have a vaccine that they're willing to use and they have approved through their system, then to me, why shouldn't EU, US be taking the time to review that in a time of pandemic? It's not. That's where it's like it's not about it's not about the company more, not about the pharmaceutical company who's developing it or whatever. It's if there's science, if there's true science behind this, then why wouldn't they want to be looking at it and reviewing it? Why wouldn't U.S. be calling up Sputnik, whoever vaccine, and saying, do you want to come show us what you've got?
Yeah, it's no longer about science, it's rather politics in this case, I think, but you're absolutely right. And in terms of clinical trials, when do you think we'll be going back to normal? You said that so many sites were affected and so many patients.
Well, we've seen a trend of since July. So June really was the peak. It was kind of like it was. You could almost see a trend where March, April, May, June, disruption, and then July, August, September starting to get normalize because and it has a lot to do with, like you said, politics of the government establishing. Okay. We understand now. You shouldn't be, after going skiing, you shouldn't be time kissing with a person you've never met before in the bar and having several drinks at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? So they were putting restrictions on what they felt they needed to do, but also trying to understand what works and what really doesn't work. Some places now, for example, Switzerland, this shocked me. They never came out and said what kind of masks, that you have to wear masks at the very beginning, where other countries are like, you have to wear a mask. Switzerland, but when you ask the Swiss regulators, they're like, well, we didn't really know what kind of mask we should be recommending. Right? And other countries like Germany, they're like, at first they were like, no mask. Then they're saying, yeah, you should wear a mask. And they weren't telling you what the standard of mask you should be wearing. They were just saying, you need to cover your nose and your mouth. They weren't saying.
Yeah, there is no such standard. You can as well use a scarf or something like that.
And the Swiss were concerned. One of the reasons why they didn't want to do it at the beginning was they were concerned about, well, then the public would be asking, well, what kind of mask should we be wearing? What is their standard for that? And I was just like, this is just really crazy stuff where I'm just like, yeah, okay. I guess I wouldn't have asked the government, well, what kind of mask would you recommend me to use? Then you go to the other extreme in the U.S. where people are saying, it's my freedom, it's my right not to wear underwear and not to wear masks, right?
Yeah.
And I was like,
we have the same. We have the same thing here in the EU. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I think it is starting to stabilize and get back to not get back to how it was before, because I don't think it will achieve that until we really understand. So I don't know how it is in other countries. All I know is what's reported. I live in Germany, and what's reported in Germany is where they actually are taking tests and saying, we're going to do a concert. We're going to have people come in. We're going to track them. We're going to see what happens. Where are people getting, if they're in a disco or if they're wherever, how are they actually obtaining receiving, if they're in contact with someone with COVID-19, et cetera. These are all tests that they're doing, studies that they're doing, so that the public understands. We need to understand what works and will not work, specifically for this COVID-19, for example. And it's quite reassuring, because then you understand, okay, the reason why they're asking me to wear my mask when I'm in a grocery store is because they actually did some tests on that, and they actually saw, okay, it actually does bring something if we're wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask. So I don't know how it is in other countries, because I haven't been following if they're actually doing those kinds of mock tests. Have you heard of anything?
Not really of mask tests, so I'm not sure how they're handling, and I haven't heard of any requirements for the masks either. So, yeah.
It's not necessarily just masks. It's just what happens when you're in if you're at a concert or if you're in a movie theater or in a bar or in a disco. These are all things that we're told we're not supposed to do. And now they're really doing the science behind that.
Yes, but we are supposed to be wearing masks with closed spaces, for sure. And maybe Diego has some information about other countries and how it is around the globe.
Well, there is not too much information yet how this will handle. It's mostly leaving to the people some tasks, you know. But no, honestly, I don't have further information about this.
Yeah, in Germany right now, the numbers are rising in certain communities. For example, in Ham, because there were 3 major weddings that occurred where one of them had 500 people attending, and that has been directly related to the numbers of people contacting COVID-19 disease. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster for sure, having 500 people in the same space.
Yeah, and it's very odd that if you think about it, this is for us really come on the landscape in March, and we're already calling it a COVID-19 era.
Yeah, it's
6 months
true.
ago.
It's been, yeah, it's absolutely true. But I think we all agree those are unprecedented times, and it's really hard and challenging for all of us. But thank you so much to both of you for your presentations and your insights. It was a great discussion, and it was a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you. And with this, I think we will be closing today's session. Please stay tuned for the next one, which will be really interesting again and focus on the medicinal cannabis. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Managing the development and life cycle of a pharmaceutical product can be beyond time-consuming, beyond costly, and beyond complex. PharmaLex enlightens with trusted expertise and empowers with cutting-edge technology. PharmaLex ensures healthier business decisions with specialized services that are adapted to fit your needs. Scalable yet approachable and innovative. Our services extend beyond market approval to include product maintenance and post-launch activities, both at a local and global level. PharmaLex, beyond knowledgeable, beyond flexible, beyond innovative, beyond trusted. And with over 90% of business from satisfied repeat customers, beyond proven. Let's take your business above and beyond. Contact us today.